Sorry about that. Just tying up a few loose ends and also filling in a few holes with the myriad of mistakes I made by throwing myself balls deep into the fray this season. And boy, was this a trip. I even managed to pick up a few stragglers along the way. So I guess I should put one last bullet in the head of this season by wrapping up the whole thing with my final thoughts. Was it worth it, or did I just waste my time by daring to have hope again? Let's find out. Is it alright to talk about this show yet without looking over my shoulder? I mean, has the shitstorm died down enough? I'd like to think we're past the controversy. You either quit the show after the first episode, somehow managed to stumble past it, or you could be like me, off in the ostracized third camp who found some sadistic pleasure in it. But I honestly thought this show was mostly okay. It's honestly not outstanding in most aspects. The plot's pacing was off for me, feeling rushed and somehow slow at the same time. The first 2 episodes and real arc zipped by without much fuss, but getting into Watertown, everything came to a screeching halt. Maybe it's because I picked up this show expecting some brutal action, but the slaughtering of goblins felt sparse towards the middle, with this stupid notion of storyline getting in the way. I'd care more if it was interesting, but it felt mostly like setup for stuff later down the line that the show cannot deliver on since it's got a limited number of episodes. But the story itself, that is to say, where things go, did make me invested enough to pick up the manga. I'll address the elephant in the room here. Not that one, we're already past that. The anime actually reshuffles the events of the story a bit from the light novel and manga adaptation. This drives some adaptation nerds nuts, but from a narrative structure it makes perfect sense. The series needs to end on a climax, a big showdown to cap off the experience, and the Watertown arc lacks a satisfying bad guy getting beaten to fulfill that niche. That's why the farm arc was moved to the end, containing a goblin lord and hitting closer to home for the protagonist. So I'll actually give props to the studio for having that sort of foresight. Getting down to some of the nitty-gritty aspects, I was a little unfair to this show when it came to its art direction. Parts of it are beautiful, particularly the backgrounds and some of the character designs, though I'm sure the CG for Goblin Slayer in an effort to cut corners when animating is a turn-off for most, particularly in the Catacombs fight with the Goblin Champion. I've never seen a CG shot go from looking so good to so bad in mere seconds from a simple camera rotation. But yeah, the show ended up being pretty okay for me, erring on the side of good, if not a tad dull during its downtimes, though the date section with Goblin Slayer and Priestess and the Watertown arc is an exception to that. I'd give this series a middling 6 out of 10 if pressed. Check it out if you like edgy themes and fantasy. On to the series I ripped into the next hardest on my season preview, Yagate Kimi ni Naru, or Bloom Into You. One of my biggest complaints right away was the art direction and the relationship. Holy hell, the first 2 episodes drove me nuts with its trying too hard editing and overly artsy metaphorical shots. I get wanting the audience to be interested in telling a story through your cuts, but there's a point it becomes intrusive to the narrative itself. Constantly causing one's eyes to bounce around the screen to keep up with the focus of the scene is grating when used ad nauseum. But I'll be a priest wrapped in a sex scandal if this series didn't pull a complete 180 and drag me in, kicking and screaming at times, into its sickly embrace. The art direction tones down enough to let the series tell the story that it's trying to tell around episode 3, and the characters play off one another and improves greatly around that time as well. The romance between Toko and Yu comes off as disingenuous or borderline abusive in the first few episodes. But not too far into the series, we see Yu has control over her situation, meaning she's there by choice. Not to mention the series subverts the typical tropes associated with the Yuri genre as well. The calm and cool as a cucumber senpai having a motive for her attitude and relying on her kohai as a reprieve from the stress? What is this bright new world outside the confines of our safe typical senpai kohai romance dynamic box? It burns! In all seriousness, Yu is one of my favorite characters from this entire season, and her relationships and character interactions with Toko are reason enough to watch this show. I'm not entirely sold on Toko as a character, her stubbornness is irritating at times, but I will admit that she and Yu make a nice couple regardless. I'm a little torn if this series is smart for using a play as a stand-in for the characters to comment on their own plot, or lazy for needing its characters to look at their own storyline reflectively through such a lens. If you're somehow sitting on the fence about this series, give it a watch for the gratuitous Yuri and departure from standard romance tropes. A respectable 8 out of 10 to be sure. Oh boy, my last punching bag on the docket. I tore into Tonari no Kyuuketsuki-san, or Miss Vampire Who Lives in My Neighborhood if you're not weebish enough to catch what I'm laying down, a new one for being so abysmally bad at comedy. I even did a follow-up video talking about my thoughts on the show after a few more episodes had aired, and I had some time to reflect on my life choices by pursuing such a fruitless endeavor. The humor, while managing to pull a small smirk or occasional chuckle out of me, isn't exactly unique enough to warrant much praise. But the series is relaxing to watch, doesn't require much thought to get, and was a decent time sink this season. I will say I enjoyed the main girl Sophie. Her facial reactions and tone resonated with me, most certainly because I identify with her particular brand of straight man and dry deliveries. Not to mention her often being the butt of the joke. So when the show sticks to that style of humor, I think it's at its strongest. But let me rein in my praise so I don't accidentally come off as giving the show credit. When it resorts to its other gag and its sack of tired jokes, like commenting about the difference between vampires and humans, it's eye-rollingly bad. Unfortunately, I'd say that makes up at least half the humor in the series. Animation-wise, I'd say the show is about as shallow as, well, yours truly when you get to know me. Some of the stills in the series look nice, buffed out with enough shoe polish you could get a fraternity thrown off campus if you left it lying around. Effective use of lighting helps add depth to an otherwise flat show, but once you see things in motion, you start to see it's all a facade. The show loves to use small pop-ups in a chibi style, which is just lazy to be honest. Specifically, this scene at the end of episode 2 screams, "We ran out of money and didn't know how to end the episode," which certainly isn't an endorsement in an oversaturated market like slice-of-life comedy. I wouldn't recommend it. Hell, I'll probably even forget about it entirely after this season's over until I stumble across it on my hard drive in a few months. Solidly slapping a 4 out of 10 on this one because it's certainly below average. On to my darling for this season, Zombieland Saga was... watch it. If you haven't, go do it. This show was amazing from start to finish for me. I don't watch idol anime, like, at all, but many are saying this is a gateway drug to the genre. And I see why. Originally I had this show pegged for a dark, absurdist comedy with a novel premise, but quickly found that wasn't all it had to offer. Don't get me wrong, the humor I fell in love with from the outset didn't disappear, but the characters are all vibrant, bringing their own personalities to that aspect and play off one another in a beautiful way. But what I wasn't expecting was a gut punch to the feels on more than one occasion. Touching on subjects like depressive slumps, conquering your fears, and even dabbling into the complexities of a second chance at life. This series manages to tell touching stories without giving the viewer tonal whiplash. Saki and Lily's backstories are all highlights that spring to mind for me. Again, telling compelling stories about characters we've already come to know without shattering that character's personality, only expanding on what you love about them. Not only doing that, but managing to keep a pretty consistent tone throughout the show, never forgetting its comedy roots. I know this might come off as disingenuous for somebody who spends so much time taking the piss out of silly 4-coma shows to immediately turn around, drop to my knees, and fillet this series so hard my jaw might just fall off. But in all seriousness, this may be a series that I revisit just because I like it so much. This isn't even touching on the finale, which managed to not only be a satisfying conclusion for the series, but left some bait for a second season to step in. Easily the best series in a season already packed with great offerings. An actual, unironic 10 out of 10. I mentioned some stragglers I picked up along the way, so I suppose I should mention my thoughts on that time I got reincarnated as a slime up to this point, though it is continuing into the next season. I already did a video on this one, you can check the iCard right here to go check it out, explaining some of the issues I had with this series, but I'll go ahead and give a bit of a summary for those who missed it. This series is a standard isekai with a novel twist that makes it somewhat enjoyable. I still find the plot contrivances, absurd power the protagonist has, and typical boner the narrative has for him obnoxious at times, but ultimately I find myself having fun when watching it. I think the curb stomp fights are like hooking up a car battery to my junk. So bad, it's good. The main cast, though not an excessively deep bunch, are an enjoyable lot to follow. Their successes, mixed with the main protagonist being an all-around good dude helping others out, keeps me coming back. I think this being a 24-episode series has benefits as well. The first 5 or so episodes were pretty dull, episode 1 being particularly egregious, but the series ramps up, getting more engaging as it continues by introducing steadily stronger opponents, building mystery, and bringing some hype moments later on. It's definitely on a slow burn, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially when paced to carry over 2 seasons like this series is. A lackluster setting and premise can be easily forgiven if the series actually does its job at being entertaining to watch, which I feel it does. Though I do dock some points for animation and originality, as this series seems to have blown its budget for both on the whole ball of goo thing. If you're a fan of one-sided beatdowns and have had your expectations on the receiving end of one recently, give it a watch. It's pure dumb fun, and I'll give it a tentative 7 out of 10 since I actually look forward to watching it each week and will continue to do so for the next season. Time to end on a series I enjoyed quite a bit and one a lot of people gravitated towards. The aptly named Normie Monogatari. No, sorry, I misread that. Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai was a solid entry this season, containing a lot of great characters and pretty gripping stories. The mostly self-contained arcs for each characters had their own twists, some done to death, others more unique, that gave this series an edge when standing out this season. But honestly, what put this over the top for me as a great series this season was the characters themselves. Each felt real, with gray emotions that interlocked with one another, informing a lot of who they were and why they behaved the way they did. Not to mention, the series contained a romance I actually bought, which is a rare commodity among anime. I think the mature, polished art style with deep characters is part of why this series stood out. It felt less like an anime and more like a story using the medium, which is what I would argue a series should be. If I had to pick some things to complain about, I could easily find a few, however. The moment-to-moment pacing is slow, with little for visual stimuli besides the characters. The series isn't high on action set pieces or artsy visuals to sell itself, which fits with the grounded aesthetic. This unfortunately leaves me, as the viewer, left staring at two characters talking for long stretches of time, with a shocking amount of detail crammed into the background. I can't tell if I should praise that or admonish it since there's effort put in, but more could have been done to make the actual focus of the scene more interesting. Though I will add that the ending left me with a bit of blue balls. But I suppose they had to leave something for the movie in 2019. Overall, a good story with great characters and passable animation, which leaves it at an 8 out of 10, whose line is it anyway points simply due to the lackluster ending. Well, with fall out of the way, I guess that means I can actually write some real reviews on shows I did enjoy this season. Delving deep into my thoughts, critically analyzing, and make a bigger ass out of myself than I already have. What's that? The winter season's already starting? Well, shit. This is gonna be a never-ending cycle, isn't it? Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and do all the other YouTube stuff because that really helps me out. Thanks for watching.